responding. Okay. And just a sound check, people can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay, great. All right, I'll start with the antitrust statement. Textile means the textile community and values diversity of views. Expert that members of this community will collaborate by sharing ideas, information, and resources of publicly available information only, and avoid discussions on price, strategic plans, or other private and sensitive information. And we also put in a disclaimer here to say, you know, this is a place where we can all convene, share views, and exchange information. So we just want to say that the views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in this webinar belong solely to the speakers or any of the participants. And the role that we strive for a textile exchange is to be a neutral one. All right, into the agenda. And before I even start, I wanted to say, my name is Anne Gillespie. I am the Director of Impact Acceleration for Textile Exchange. We have our LEA team on this call. We have Larissa, who does all of the communications and coordination of this work, and she's responsible for some of the thinking behind this slide deck and design. We have Stephanie Pekorski, who will be speaking a bit later on. We have Nicole Lambert, who will also be speaking. And we have Josefina, who will be running one of the breakout rooms. I also have to give an honorary mention to Deborah Taylor, who's been working with us and filling in for Nicole while she was on maternity leave, but she's here as a participant this time. So you can see the agenda, we're really focusing on what is the role of the RLRT and how can we use it to achieve the really kind of urgent climate goals that we're all facing. So we're going to start by looking at the Climate Plus goals and the new direction that we're setting for the Responsible Leather Roundtable. We're going to look at the objectives and scope, and then we're going to review the stakeholder input that we received from all of you in the RLRT Summit, which is in December. And then we'll have a quick review of the Leather Impact Accelerator, and then we get into the glorious part of this whole call, which is to really dig in deep about how do we move ourselves forward. So I'm going to give an overview of the industry commitments to really set the stage and give us the context, and then we're going to break out into a number of discussion rooms for a fairly intense discussion around there'll be 3 sets of questions. And then we'll come back and then we'll do some quick brainstorming as a full group. So I really urge you to stick through all of time to share information, to meet some of your colleagues and contribute to where we're heading. And the carrot at the end of this all is, if you stay through to the end, we will send you the link to the Guardians of the Grassland video, which is a fantastic video put out by the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. It's short, but it really helps drive home, you know, the potential for cattle grazing to address some of these issues. So starting with a review of the Climate Plus goals, hopefully most people are familiar with this, but textile exchange, new strategy, and which is to enable and guide the textile industry to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030 in the pre-spinning phase of textile fiber materials production, or maybe we should just say the raw material source with respect for leather. This is a strategy that's really going to be grounded in partnership. We've got partnerships with other industry organizations, from the Science Based Target Network through to the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and individual programs that are operating on the ground. It's going to take all of us working together to do this. And we're not just stopping at climate. We are also, through this goal, hoping to address soil health, biodiversity, and water. And in many cases, the solution for one is the solution for others. So I want to review the overall objectives of the RLRT. We've talked about setting meaningful goals, determining and measuring practice towards these goals, identifying and prioritizing the actions over this next decade to get us to 2030. And then we really want to mobilize all of the stakeholders in our group and beyond to take actions to meet those goals. And then we also have to establish the partnerships with those major players, organizations, businesses, even potentially governments, to create that collective action that's needed to scale up. So this is really important. This is what our work is going to be through the RLRT. And I really hope everyone on this call really commits to being part of this going forward, and that we can bring more into the mix. So on this call, our main focus is going to be setting the meaningful goals and then identifying and prioritizing the actions. We'll probably not even get to that second one on this call, but we're going to set the groundwork to set that really big industry goal that we can strive for. And then obviously after that, we need to mobilize people to take action. So a reminder that the scope of the RLRT is the full beef leather value chain, and our emphasis in terms of meeting the goals is on the impacts at the farm level. I also want to take a moment to talk to you about the terms of reference. We do have updated terms of reference. I think Larissa may be able to give us a link into the chat function if you want to see it, and we'll certainly follow through and when we send the notes with the link. Really encourage you to read that. We do not have to sign anything on this, but it's important that you're familiar with it to really understand what the scope and priorities are. And we also invite you to engage with us through the hub. And again, we'll send you the link to that. I think, Larissa, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but everybody should be linked into the hub. If not, you can contact us. Contact Larissa at textileexchange.org and she can be sure to get you on. But this is a great place to review the resources, contact us, or discuss with other community members. So we're now going to talk about the Leather Impact Accelerator, and I'm going to pass it on to Nicole.
Hi, everyone. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Leather Impact Accelerator, sorry. So we'll be quite brief on it. But before I give you a brief introduction to the Leather Impact Accelerator, we just wanted to go through the stakeholder feedback we had received back in 2017, approximately. So before any of the Textile Exchange work was actually launched. And so these are the kind of the challenges that were identified mainly by brands and communicated to us. So first of all, from a brand perspective, so it's little transparency in the supply chain, reputational risks related to the different sustainability risks throughout the entire supply chain, the inability to connect to farms. And that is due notably to the fact that, well, first of all, brands are so distant from the farms in the supply chain, but also the fact that leather today has very little value for a producer. And so brands have very little economic leverage to be able to put pressure onto the producer to carry out and address priorities for a brand, let's say. Challenges with mapping supply chains, and confusion about what standards to refer to. So if I have a producer that is certified to a Brazilian standard or to an Italian standard, what does that mean? And a lot of confusion there. The next point, Anne. There we go. And then here from the leather supply chain perspective, or it was also identified by brands, is again, multiple options for environmental certifications, low adoption of social certifications, and also sometimes, depending where they are in the leather supply chain, but connecting with the end brands, which have been complicated. And then finally, from the farmer's perspective, No visibility and recognition of best practices at this level. Little financial support from the end user, so from the brands. No value for their hides, which we've touched upon. No connection to the brands, and again, overlapping certification and requirements. So these are all the different challenges that we, were identified and led Textile Exchange to work on leather, and finally developing the Leather Impact Accelerator. So if we move on to the next slide, please, Anne.
Yeah, apologies for all this. I'm trying to send a note at the same time. Oh, here it's missing. Okay.
Anyhow, this is just to show you, that the complexity of the leather supply chain, and these are the different tools that were developed by Textile Exchange and that sit under LEA. The idea is that these tools address major sustainability challenges in the different levels of the supply chain by leveraging existing solutions used by the industry and just packaging them up under one program. Yeah, and so these are the different elements, and we'll maybe go more into detail on the next slide, please. Yeah, so the idea is, probably one more click. or maybe let's just put through all the clicks through, and like that, they'll be up there. There we go.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, so we have the impacting incentives, which allow to the brands to connect directly to the farmers. So we don't have that long, having to go through that long supply chain to connect directly to the farmers. Here we have the impact incentives, which is an excellent tool to allow brands to communicate directly their priorities to the farmers and to reward these producers accordingly. Then we have at the farm level today, so these are the sustainable challenges that we are addressing through LEA. So there's deforestation and conversion and animal welfare. And then when it comes to the supply chain, we're looking at we've got the leather production standards benchmark, which address environmental and social issues. And the idea again here through this standard benchmark is to identify standards that meet a benchmark that is set by the Leather Impact Accelerator. And finally, doing that at the same time, we're also trying to build up traceability on one end with the farmers, asking farmers to trace back each animal from where they come from and where they go to. And then on the supply chain level also, trying to build up that traceability throughout the whole supply chain down to slaughterhouse. And finally, we have the LEA Claims Guide, which holds all of this together and allows brands to make claims about the work they're doing through LEA. Yep.
Okay, so I'm actually going to take this next bit on. Stephanie actually had to run off, but I'm going to take us through a review of the feedback that we got from the summit in December. And it was a very engaging discussion, as you can see from this diagram from our amazing Carlotta. There was a lot of ground that we covered. There's a lot of issues. It kind of speaks to the complexity of the overall situation that we're dealing with. If you were not in that summit and you'd like to review any of it, there is a recording. We'll send it out with a follow-up note, and it'll be in the slide right here. So there were a number of questions that we asked, and we used the Mentimeter to gather the responses. And we were started by looking at leather and the disproportionate impact that it's given through the HIG MS. We're asking, what aspects of cattle production do we prioritize? And the feedback that we got was the grazing systems, deforestation and land conversion, and to some degree enteric emissions. There was kind of a smaller number. The bigger numbers came through with the green, and the other included land management, which could be another way of looking at the grazing systems, animal welfare, and traceability. The next one was, who do we work with? And the key names that came out with a fair number of clicks behind them was the Savory Institute, the farmers and the farm groups, which is of course critical, and the supply chain members, and also the food industry. Then which industry and global goals most deserved our attention? So the SDGs, definitely the UNFCCC, the Fashion Pact, and the Science-Based Targets Initiative and the Science-Based Target Network. And I'm going to speak to those a little bit further on. Oops, take away my click. The next one was, what are the other aspects of leather production that we need to measure and track our impacts on? Biodiversity, animal welfare, and then the other was soil health, chemical use, and then again, to a lighter degree, water and social. And then what kind of KPIs? People suggested the preserved forest area, the legal area, and voluntary area being kept, I think, under preservation. So that would probably overlap with the preserved forest area, the GHG emissions, and the carbon reduction, and then as well animal welfare. And then we really started to dig deep and pick into people's brains, trying to say, what data systems should we look at, and what do we want to align with when we're setting our baselines and our targets and measurement systems? So EOV, the Ecological Outcome Verification, which has been developed by the Savory Institute, was mentioned many, many times. And then, of course, the science-based targets, this carbon disclosure project, and the LWG. And then finally, what kind of strategies should we focus on to meet the Climate Plus goals? And I think this was, I'm not sure if we had checks on the left-hand side, but we definitely want to scale up regenerative agriculture. We need to collaborate with the GRSB and the national roundtables, cross-industry collaboration, and promote LEA and set those industry targets. So that brings us into the next steps. And I want to start by giving you some background on the thinking and some of the work that Textile Exchange has been doing. And when you look back at that feedback, we've had a lot of, first of all, we have a Climate Plus goal that's linked to carbon. There's been a lot of call for us to look at targets that are specific about carbon, the Carbon Disclosure Project, science-based targets. One of the issues that we're having is, how do we measure the current scopes of work for LEA against those goals? And we've been just digging around like crazy, trying to figure out, how do we do this? What's the available information? Can we relate amount of preserved land back to carbon? Does that count towards carbon reduction targets, etc.? And from what we can see now, and we're hopefully going to find out a lot more, but deforestation conversion free, from what we understand, does not necessarily count towards GHG reductions. And that's because we're not reducing the amount of carbon. What we're doing is protecting the amount of carbon that's currently stored in the forest. So we still want to dig around and see, can the amount of carbon that is being preserved, whether it's through that or potentially through regenerative farming, etc., even if we're not increasing the amount of carbon that's stored, if we're protecting it, can that be used towards those goals? So that's one of the limitations of our current scope. However, and as you'll see in a few minutes, most of the global commitments, or many of the global commitments and the pressures that brands are facing, really do call out to halt deforestation. So the other thing about deforestation and conversion free is, we know that it also protects biodiversity. So they know there's a huge amount of value. So we're also part of a larger project with the Science-Based Target Network, and that's looking at those biodiversity impacts and how do we capture that across all of the different fibers. And then obviously in this context, how do we map that over to the impact incentives relating to deforestation conversion free for LEA? Another point that I need to make is, you know, even with that 2030 goal that we've set, we kind of need a baseline if we're really to map that 45% reduction. And we have a figure that we're currently using, and that's what gave us that kind of big impact on leather. But it's based on, let's just say, some contested LCAs. The LCAs that have been used to determine that baseline are not really as global in scope and don't take into account kind of maybe the real full picture of leather's impact. We absolutely recognize that, and we are kind of waiting for other industry groups that are working to help improve the quality of those LCAs so we can work from a better baseline. But in the meantime, what we do know is, you know, all fibers have an impact. Leather, and as a kind of a grazing system, definitely does. And there are things that we can do, and it's really important that we just start doing them. So again, looking back at that strategy, the areas that we're choosing to focus on to begin with through the RLRT is to focus on promoting LEA. We've spent 3 years developing LEA to meet the needs of the brands and ultimately to address these goals. And we're going to look at doing that by setting industry targets that take advantage of LEA and leverage all the work that we've done so that we can make that progress. So this is the proposal, is that we start by setting an industry target. We look at how to drive the use of LEA, and then we're going to report on outcomes. And to as much as we can, we'll have to watch our time. We'll dig in mostly into setting that industry target and trying to figure out how do we do that. And then we can look at, well, how do we drive the use of LEA? And then we'll save the reporting on outcomes to a later discussion. So I'm going to start by talking about the current LEA corporate commitment. And we're now referring to this as our phase 1 commitment. This is the one that is being published on the website. We've discussed it a number of times. And it has 2 modules, and it's, of course, everything here is optional. One is the impact incentives. And the idea is that within a time frame, and we're suggesting 5 years, but it could be longer if somebody's really having a difficult supply chain or challenges in getting the resources together. But we suggest a 5-year time frame, and within that 5 years, you as a brand using leather will address 100% of your leather use through the impact incentives, or it could be through physical sourcing if you're able to do that. So if you use our footprint calculator and you find out that you're using 10,000 hides, then we would, to meet this commitment, you would buy 10,000 impact incentives, which is equivalent to 10,000 cows. And that's how we're trying to help you address your footprint and then also set a goal that has some meaning. And then the other part of the module, or the other module in this, is the supply chain mapping and certification. So there we're saying within the same time period, if you're going to match up the 2 modules, you would also trace and map your supply chain back 1 stage further each year. And for each stage that you map, you would ensure that they're meeting the environmental and social benchmarks that have been recognized by LEA. So, you know, your tier 1 might be already LWG certified, and they still need to meet a social benchmark. And we'll be sure that we have some social benchmarks that that are recognized, and then ask that tier to work with those. So we can work our way backwards, and then at the end of that 5 years, hopefully we'll have quite a few brands that have mapped their supply chains all the way back to the slaughterhouse. And then we've got all of a huge group of farms where the farmers are DCF and meeting animal welfare, and then we can create that full link so that brands can have a fully traceable supply chain, which is really what our phase 2 commitment is about. So once that phase 1 commitment has been met by any individual brand, they could then move to the phase 2 commitment, which would be within X years, and we'll look at the numbers and we can talk about that, is to commit to source leather from fully traceable LEA approved supply chains. So that would mean that you would know that every step along the way has met one of our LEA benchmarks, starting with the cow-calf farm or the birth farm, through the raising farm, then the direct farm, the slaughterhouses, and then all the way through the supply chain. And that'll be animal welfare and DCF for the farms, and animal welfare for the slaughterhouse, and then social environmental for the full supply chain. And then throughout it will be those traceability requirements. So it's a big ask. I don't think the industry has any hope of delivering on this right now, but that's the whole point of this kind of long game approach with LEA, where we're trying to build up the conditions for the leather supply network to enable brands to deliver on this. So just stop and see if any of you have questions. I know I'm running through a lot here, but if you have any questions, please pop them in chat. And if I'm missing them, maybe Larissa or Nicole, you could just let me know. All right, so now I'm going to dig into some of the corporate commitments that are out there already. And I'm going to start with the ones that Textile Exchange has done. We've got, first of all, we had the 2025 Sustainable Cotton Challenge. And that was asking or encouraging brands and retailers to commit to source 100% of their cotton from the most sustainable sources by the year 2025. And I'm bringing this up because we at Textile Exchange have had really good success with setting up these industry commitments, getting the roundtables and the community to sign up to them and really promote them. And with the 2025 cotton one, we now have 82 companies that are committed to sourcing 100% sustainable cotton by 2025. And then there's guidance, of course, around what sustainable cotton is. We also have the recycled polyester commitment. There was the original one, and the first one was in 2017, and it encouraged brands and retailers to publicly commit to accelerating their use of recycled polyester by 25% by 2020. And it had 59 companies that signed on, and they increased their rPET use by 39% within the first 3 years. So obviously that was effective in getting some traction. What we don't know is, what was the baseline and what the actual impact was, or at least I don't know that. But then just last week, actually, they announced the 2025 Recycled Polyester Challenge. And this one's phrased differently, saying we are challenging the apparel industry to commit to bringing the percentage of recycled polyester up from, and this is the industry overall percentage, from 14% to 45%, which equals 17.4 million metric tons by 2025. And then we encourage brands to commit to the most ambitious uptake target possible. So unlike the first one, which was focusing on just increasing your own use by a certain percentage, this is saying we're going for an overall industry-wide impact, and everybody needs to do the best they can. And then this wasn't a challenge, but within the corporate fiber materials benchmark, otherwise known as the CFMB, we have, through the data that we've collected on leather, that we see that 41% of respondents reported that their SMART target commits them to use 100% more sustainable leather. So I don't have any more detail than that, but obviously we can see that a number of brands are already committing to be more responsible with their leather use. And wouldn't it be so much more powerful if we turn this into an industry-wide commitment where everybody's actions can align to drive the use of these common tools to show that progress towards a really bigger goal, and hopefully bring back rewards that help everybody more than doing it individually. So, quick question here. Izzy question, is the LEA work being linked with the UNFCCC raw material work stream? Not yet specifically, but there are some links to the Fashion Pact, if I can give you that as an answer. Okay, so I'm just going to get clicking through too many here. I'm going to start with the Paris Agreement. So these are some big agreements that when I was looking through what are the different big global commitments and agreements that are touching on deforestation. In the Paris Agreement, it says that parties should take action to conserve a whole bunch of things, but includes forests. So forests are definitely called out there. And they also talk about positive incentives for activities relating to reducing emissions from deforestation. So again, I think we can see LEA in there with the impact incentives. We also have the Fashion Pact. And the goals that I called out here is achieving 25% low impact material sourcing by 2025. Obviously that can cut across many different materials, but they really called out the member commitments here to support zero deforestation and sustainable forest management by 2025. So that 2025 is coming up on us really fast, but for the Fashion Pact members, this is a commitment they've made. So again, we're definitely looking to tie LEA into the Fashion Pact companies to help them meet this goal. And then this is one I found really interesting, which is the New York Declaration on Forests. And it's a voluntary, non-binding international declaration to take action to halt global deforestation. So they're not stopping halfway at all. It's just stop it. And what is really interesting to me is that they believe that they could reduce the global emission of greenhouse gases by 4.5 to 8.8 billion metric tons per year. So that is the kind of numbers and data that we need to use so that we can map out our efforts to stop deforestation through LEA back to some of those carbon numbers. So I haven't been able to dig in and find out how they did this metric and who do we speak to, but that could be a really interesting area to explore. And if anybody has any links to the New York Declaration or any knowledge on how we can map out the preserved forest over to carbon or greenhouse gas impacts, that would be fantastic. I also wanted to take a look through the lens of the investor focus. And two groups we've spoken to over the years, they've been stakeholders from the beginning. We've got Ceres and UNPRI. I just pulled out UN here because they have some big numbers that they pulled together. So this is actually a slightly older data. I assume that the numbers have increased since then, but they have a statement. They have an investor statement on deforestation and forest fires in the Amazon. They have 253 investors representing approximately $17.7 trillion in assets. So if you're a brand or a big company, maybe a supply chain company on this call, your assets may be part of this. And I know that in having some of my discussions with them over the years, they are looking at the leather industry as a maybe a target or an area of interest on how to drive towards this goal. So part of the statement is that we recognize the crucial role that tropical forests play in tackling climate change, protecting biodiversity, and ensuring ecosystems services. And one of the things they're asking for is for companies to publicly disclose and implement a commodity-specific no deforestation policy, quantifiable time-bound commitments, etc. So in the discussions I've had with them, I've said, look, you can't expect that of the leather industry at this point because there are very few value chains that can deliver the traceability to meet this commitment. So it's another area where we can, if we set a commitment ourselves and we can come back to them and say, look, this is the commitment we're working towards. It will eventually lead to this, but understand that there's a lot of will, a lot of momentum, and hopefully that will allow them to support us or encourage them to support the work that we're doing. So I'm also going to take a few moments to talk about the Science-Based Targets Initiative and the Science-Based Target Network. So I'm sure many of you already know about the SBTs, but they're basically there to show companies how much and how quickly they need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to prevent the worst effects of climate change. And we're focusing here on scope 3, which are the what they're calling the indirect emissions, such as the extraction and production of purchased materials. So that would be leather, everything, the emissions related to leather. And if you signed on, if your scope 3 emissions cover more than 40% of your combined scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, then they must cover scope 3. So it's a mandatory element. And I would just hope that any company is addressing their scope 3 emissions. So there's a few examples here of companies that have made public commitments to their scope 3. Guess has said they're going to reduce their absolute scope 3 emissions by 30%. Ferragamo says 42%, and Brooks Running is 15% from a 2018 base year. So these are really big, meaningful commitments. The Science-Based Target Network is very, very active in reaching out to brands, getting them on board, supporting them. If you're not already part, I would certainly encourage you to talk with them. And then we also have the Science-Based Target Networks, which is pretty much doing the same thing, but focusing on kind of not the greenhouse gas targets and numbers, but kind of the nature, the value of nature behind the use of these materials. So they're saying they're in the development process. They have not set clear targets and measurables, although the action is happening very, very continually. But they're saying they want to develop nature, science-based targets through creating methods, tools, and guidance that'll build on what companies are already doing and helps them to go one step further. And one thing I wanted to call out, it's not quite specific to the SBTN, but it's an incredibly important initiative launched by Caring and Conservation International. And they have set up a fund to transition 1 million hectares of land to regenerative practices. And then they're calling for people to apply for that. So you can see there's a lot of activity in the biodiversity area. There's also a lot of activity in the greenhouse gas area. I think we all understand the pressures our planet is facing and the need for combined action. So with that, I'd like to move to some discussion time, because I think this is where we can get really deep into some of the discussions. And what we're going to do is set up 3 breakout rooms. We're going to start with the assumption that LEA is going to be used to set and meet the commitments. And we're trying to address through various lenses, what kind of target should we set for this? And we're going to use the KISS principle. It's normally known as keep it simple, stupid. Although a friend of mine calls it keep it simple and stupid. I'm not sure which one you want to go for. But we're going to break into these 3 groups. Larissa, I think we're just going to do 3 groups. I'm not sure if Stephanie's still with us, so we'll each lead one. Group A will be led by Josefina. Group B will be led by Nicole, and I will lead Group C. So I think that should come through. And Larissa, if you could copy the questions into the chat box so that everybody has a vision of them. So we're going to set a timer for 15 minutes. This is a really good opportunity for everybody to network and finally have your voice and stop listening to just me. And then we're going to come back and we're going to review the outcomes of the discussion. And then we're going to move on to a couple more brainstorming questions. So any questions in the chat box before we move?
So I'll just take a minute to sign in people to the breakout rooms. All right. And
Okay.
then if anybody has any question, please post them in the chat box so we can see what's happening. All right.
Great. And then you'll call us right back after 15 minutes, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Good. Thank you.
Let me...
And also saw that through a shorter time frame, around 5 years. But then from the leather production perspective, there was a lot of emphasis on, it being sometimes a bit tricky, putting a clear number on a target. First of all, because there is a need to be very clear on the type of baseline that target would be built on. And that today, there might not be data available, or trustworthy data, let's say, well, accurate enough data to be able to build these targets on. And then second of all, the fact as well that, this was, I think, more specific to if we were making targets more related to the leather production side of things, suppliers making the effort and investing in making those targets achievable for brands, and then brands not being accountable for it. But we kind of derailed a bit from the initial questions. But yeah, so that was us.
Oh, great insights. And any good discussion does derail from the initial questions, I'd say. Thank you. So that I was with Group C. It was very brand dominant, with Kim from JBS holding out for the entire supply network. JBS being one of the largest leather tannery meat packer organizations in the world. So he had a lot of weight on his shoulders. The key points was, first of all, it is great, definitely an agreement that targets are good. We had one point, which is, we want to be sure we don't exclude companies whose own personal or corporate targets don't fit in. So one of the challenges to find ways to recognize those, or to set the target broadly enough that it will allow those companies to engage with that. And then obviously we can look at different ways of reporting out on company progress. Is also a big point, which has already been raised, that in order for brands to meet commitments, they are going to need to work with their value chains. And it's going to be really important to help the supply chain maybe develop the tools so the supply chain really understand what it is we're trying to achieve and get that engagement. I mean, we're already there with JBS. They're kind of the model for that, but we can certainly expand that further. And a good point coming from the JBS side was that the government targets and industry targets really help them to move forward with their work. And when there's that alignment, and obviously the more brands and the more people standing behind a commitment, the more powerful it's going to be. And that helps them with their own internal communications so that they can get themselves organized to meet all the different expectations that we have. And the final thought that came up was, when supply chain members are dealing with multiple commitments, company A is committed to this, company B to that, the government's asking for that, it's almost akin to dealing with multiple certifications where they've got to, report through different lenses and meet different targets and so on. So it really speaks to the need to have one bigger commitment that we can use, hopefully to link back to some of those other big commitments that we've set around, or that have been set for us through the Fashion Pact and the Paris Agreement and so on. And that will just make it more powerful and more easy for everyone, particularly as we start to look through, how do we gather the data and find a good way to report out on that. So before I go any further, I just want to give a chance, any other points that anybody wants to raise in the through the chat box, or you can unmute yourself. No? Okay. Now I'm going to make this a brainstorm. I'll ask you to take a few minutes. This is not going to be through a breakout session, but if you can each take a few minutes, type out a commitment statement that you think could be effective. And then we're just going to ask you to put this into the chat box. We were trying to get a more sophisticated system for sharing, but we ran out of time. But for now, if you could just write a commitment statement into the chat box. If you really don't want everybody to see it, you can send it to Larissa privately or myself. And then we will just kind of use that, scan through a few of those and try to use this as an opportunity to pick up some of those keywords. So I'm going to stop talking now. I'm going to set the timer for 3 minutes, and then I'll come back. Okay, that's the sound of my timer. Left, so if you have anything, feel free to just type it into the chat box, and then we'll close it up in 1 minute. Okay, so thank you. I've seen a number of people starting to put it in, and I'm going to start reading through them and see what else, as I'm reading through, please add anything else that you've put in. So 1, the value chain commits to best practice and zero leather harm by 2025 and commits to regenerative practices by 2030. Wow, that's a big one. Good. I won't give the name, but somebody made a joke saying we will no longer source leather. And that is actually a commitment that a lot of leather and beef people are a bit concerned, the no beef, no leather movement. And we can certainly talk about that extensively, but I think we have a huge opportunity to do positive good through leather. I'm glad that was just a joke. So another one, brands will buy leather that is linked to certificates like LWG and likes, including a focus on the ZDH conformant chemistry. Traceability, animal welfare, and social standards will get increased attention. By 2025, on-farm emission reductions and removals are in development, are on track to reach 50% of the industry 2030 carbon reduction goal. Yes, and a note that does require a baseline number, and that's, I think, one of the challenges. We won't be able to do so much of a percentage decrease because we aren't working from a baseline. Another one, in terms of company commitments, full legal compliance can be extremely complicated and difficult to verify in the supply chain, posing challenges and costs for companies whereas a zero deforestation commitment is much more straightforward and simple and much easier to tackle and verify, or to track and verify. Our recommendation is that companies consider including language, particularly for Brazilian sourcing, that explicitly outlines requirements for tanneries and other suppliers to source bovine hides exclusively from slaughterhouses that have implemented credible and effective supply chain monitoring systems, in addition to relying on leather industry certification bodies for assurances on origin of materials. This ensures that meat packers only source cattle from direct supplying ranches that are zero deforestation compliant and are actively working towards expanding monitoring to cover their indirect suppliers, protecting companies from external risks related to deforestation. Okay, so that's a lot. And you know, I think you'll appreciate from the range of responses and also from the number of responses we didn't get, this is going to be a tricky one. And you know, we will kind of take it on internally to start putting together some language that pulls from these suggestions and from the feedback we've had from these discussion groups. We'll start generating some kind of thought starters, as one of my colleagues like to say, something that we can all hate. And then we'll start picking it apart and working towards something that is truly a commitment that is hopefully fairly simple and